It's 1931. A woman stands alone on a train platform, clutching her purse, listening to the rhythmic clatter of metal on metal echoing through the depot. She's well dressed in a fitted jacket, hat pinned neatly in place, but her hands are trembling. Beside her rest two steamer trunks. Blood is leaking from the corners. The stench of decay is thick in the air. A baggage handler approaches and asks her for the keys. She smiles politely, says she's lost them. When the handler walks away, she slips into the crowd and disappears. When the trunks are opened later that day, station workers recoil in horror. Inside, they find the dismembered bodies of two women, grotesquely packed like doll parts. This is the story of Winnie Ruth Judd, the woman who would become known as the Trunk Murderess, a woman whose trial became a spectacle. Her story is the stuff of legend, offering more questions than answers. Could this petite woman have really dismembered the bodies all by herself? In 1931, Phoenix, Arizona wasn't the sprawling desert metropolis it is today. It was a modest town bordered by 12th Street to the east and 7th Avenue to the west. People came to Phoenix for their health, seeking the dry desert air to recover from illnesses like tuberculosis. That was the reason Winnie Ruth Judd came to Phoenix. Born on January 29, 1905 in Oxford, Indiana, she only ever went by Ruth, according to her lawyers. Her early life was shaped by illness and isolation. As a child, she suffered from pneumonia and then tuberculosis, which plagued her for the rest of her life. Her upbringing in a strict religious household left her socially awkward, unable to participate in school activities or socialize like other children. At 19, Ruth married Dr. William Judd, a man more than 20 years her senior. William was a morphine addict, his addiction likely stemming from injuries sustained during World War I. They lived together in Mexico for a while, but Ruth's health deteriorated and William's addiction worsened. Their marriage crumbled, and in 1930 Ruth left him and moved to Phoenix, Arizona to start over. She quickly found work as a medical secretary at the Grunrow Medical Memorial Clinic and became close friends with two young women, Agnes Ann Leroy and Hedvig Sammy Samuelson. The three were inseparable, bonded by their shared experiences of navigating life as single women in a new city. Then came Jack Holleran, a wealthy and married Phoenix businessman. Ruth began a passionate affair with Jack, but Jack wasn't exclusive. He was also lavishing attention on Anne and Sammy. That's when the jealousy started. Quiet, seething jealousy. The kind of jealousy that can grow into something deadly. On the night of October 16th of 1931, Ruth was supposed to have a date with Jack, but Jack never showed. Annoyed and humiliated, Ruth decided to visit Anne and Sammy's house instead. They drank, gossiped, and eventually decided to sleep over. But then, something snapped. The next morning, Ruth emerged from the apartment with gunshot wounds to her hand. Inside the apartment, Anne and Sammy lay dead. Anne had been shot in the head. Sammy's body was mutilated, dismembered with surgical precision. Ruth later claimed it was self-defense, that Sammy had pulled a gun on her and Anne had attacked her with an ironing board. They'd struggled and the gun went off, the bullet grazing Ruth's hand. In another version, Sammy had threatened to tell Jack that Ruth had introduced him to a woman who had syphilis. But forensics told a different story. Anne was shot in the head at point-blank range while she was sleeping. Sammy was shot through the hand as if she had thrown it up in defense. The second bullet went into Sammy's head. And after the shooting, Ruth calmly cleaned the scene. She removed Sammy's body and placed it on the kitchen floor. And then she retrieved a bread knife and sawed off Sammy's head and lower legs, packed them into a steamer trunk, and stuffed Anne's intact body into another. By the morning of October 18th, Ruth had booked a one-way ticket to Los Angeles on the Golden State Limited. Inside the trunks, the police found Sammy's body cut into pieces. They also found the gun, spent shell casings, and a green-handled bread knife. Ruth was arrested days later. The trial was inevitable, but no one expected the circus it would become. The press called Ruth the Tiger Woman. Reporters from the Arizona Republic and the Los Angeles Times filled the courtroom, jotted down notes with pencils, the scratch of graphite on paper punctuated by the occasional popping of flash bulbs. Spectators lined up outside the courthouse for hours just to get a glimpse of her. Women in hats and pearls fanned themselves against the heat, whispering behind gloved hands. Reporters at the center of it all sat at a small, frail woman with bandages on her left hand, the woman everyone had come to see. The crime scene itself had become a tourist attraction. The bungalow where the murders happened was open to the public, and the landlord charged 10 cents for tours. People trampled through the house, stepping over bloodstains and peering into the bedrooms where Ann and Sammy died. County Attorney Lloyd Andrews wanted the death penalty. His case was simple. Ruth had killed out of jealousy. The defense, led by Paul Schenck, claimed Ruth was insane. Ruth's behavior in court didn't help. She screamed at the psychiatrist who testified against her. She knew what she was doing, the psychiatrist said on the stand. She dismembered the body not because she was psychotic, but because she was trying to avoid being caught. "You'd betrayed me. Get out." Ruth tried to run from the courtroom, screaming that the sheriff was framing her. She had to be physically restrained. Ruth's bandaged hand became a key focus during her 1932 trial. Witnesses were grilled over which hand was injured and when. Dr. Franklin of the Grunow Clinic testified that Ruth's right hand was bandaged early Saturday, but Grace Mitchell, a patient at the clinic that morning, swore it was her left. Richard Swartz and Fred Homburger, who moved the murder trunks on Saturday night, saw no bandage at all. And 5 other witnesses who saw Ruth on Sunday couldn't agree on which hand was wrapped, or if it was wrapped at all. The truth had been hiding in plain sight. Ruth was injured in both hands, slightly in her right and seriously in her left, where a .25 caliber bullet was still lodged. For decades, the reason Ruth never testified at her 1932 murder trial remained a mystery, until Jerry Lefkowitz claimed Ruth told him that newspaper mogul William Randolph Hearst, who was bankrolling her defense in exchange for exclusive coverage, pressured her lawyers to keep her off the stand. She said Hearst thought it would sell more papers if she didn't testify, Lefkowitz recalled. But that explanation doesn't hold up. Hearst would have sold more papers with juicy headlines about Ruth's testimony, so why was Ruth really silenced? The jury, by the way, didn't buy the insanity defense. They found her guilty of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced her to death by hanging. But then, just days before her execution, Ruth was declared insane and sent to the Arizona State Hospital. That's when the escapes started. She escaped 7 times over the next 2 decades. Once, she lived under a false name in California for 7 years before the authorities tracked her down. In 1969, Ruth was finally paroled. She lived quietly in Phoenix until her death in 1998 at the age of 93. But here's the thing about Ruth's story. It never quite added up. How did a frail woman with tuberculosis single-handedly dismember a body with surgical precision? How did she pack 2 of them into trunks and carry them to a train station without help? And why was her lover, Jack Holleran, wealthy, connected Jack Holleran, never charged with anything? There were rumors that Jack was there that night, that Jack helped her clean that scene and pack the bodies, that Ruth took the fall to protect him. Ruth never implicated Jack. Even in the 1933 letter, where she confessed to the murders, Ruth insisted she acted alone. Maybe that was loyalty. Maybe that was fear. The timing of the murders remains one of the biggest mysteries in the Winnie Ruth Judd case. Her story shifted constantly. In some versions, the murders happened after a quarrel on Friday night, but in her April 6 confession letter, Ruth claimed she hid in the front room Friday night, then shot Ann in cold blood Saturday morning and killed Sammy after a struggle over the gun. Witnesses didn't help clarify things. Some claimed they heard shots on Friday night, others swore it was Saturday morning. Jana Bomberspach, in her true crime book The Trunk Murderess, Winnie Ruth Judd, suggests that Ruth killed Ann in self-defense on Friday night, but that Sammy survived the initial gun battle. In the book's final chapters, Bomber's Back floats a dark theory that a second gunman, possibly Holleran himself, finished Sammy off the next morning. Her evidence, a report from an autopsy surgeon claiming 2 different caliber bullets were found in the victims' heads, a 25 caliber in Samuelson's and a 32 in Leroy's. But retired Arizona Republic reporter Charles Kelly disputes that. He says that later reports and police interviews with the surgeon confirmed that both bullets were 25 caliber. Jonna writes maybe the surgeon was mistaken about the caliber, but based on what? The truth remains elusive. Ruth's version of events keeps changing. Jack Holleran's shadow lingers over the whole bloody mess. In an affidavit attached to her appeal, Ruth admitted she initially told her lawyer the murders happened on Saturday morning to protect her husband, Dr. Judd, from learning about her affair with Jack Holleran. But later, Ruth confessed to Schenck that the killings actually happened around 11 p.m. on Friday night, and according to Richardson, Ruth stuck to the Saturday story to protect Holleran out of gratitude for his attempt to help her dispose of the bodies and cover up the crime. The letter Ruth wrote in 1933 from Florence Prison's death row, but never sent, was only discovered in 2014. It was written to her attorney, Howard G. Richardson, and donated anonymously to the Arizona State Archives a few years ago, and it was a game changer. It's been corroborated by police reports, trial transcripts, and recently uncovered affidavits. The letter answered long-held questions about when and how the murders occurred and inspired new theories about their aftermath. Questions remain, though. Where has this letter, now available online as part of the State Archives' Arizona Memory Project, been hiding all these years? And why did pretty much no one know it existed for so long? In it, Ruth tells a version of her premeditated murder, the story she's told time and again according to court documents and pretrial interviews, but that no one seemed willing to hear. In 1931, you couldn't plead insanity without first admitting to the crime. That's what made Ruth's April 6 confession so damaging. She destroyed her own insanity defense, said one of her lawyers, Larry Debus. In the letter, Ruth shows she knows right from wrong. She demonstrates premeditation, planning, and an understanding of consequence. That's all a jury needs to determine that she's sane. Cutting up a body doesn't make her look insane. It makes her look calculating. That's why attorney Mel McDonald believed Ruth's lawyer buried the letter. She says, I think he read it and said, holy crap, I can't use this. She's cutting up bodies, stuffing them in trunks, taking them on a train, going to work the next day like nothing happened. No defense attorney can work with that if he's trying for a self-defense plea. So he hid it. No one knew it existed. But Ruth did. And she wanted that letter back, desperately. The most damning proof that Ruth's April 6 letter was more than just another crazed confession wasn't in what she wrote. It was in how desperately she tried to get it back. Between June and November of 1953, Ruth wrote at least 6 letters to Fern Richardson, the widow of her former attorney, Howard Richardson. All 6 are now on file at the Arizona Historical Society in Tucson. In each letter, Ruth begged Fern to return the confession. Ruth was preparing for a new sanity hearing after 20 years in the state hospital. If declared sane, she'd be transferred to Florence Prison, where she could appeal her case and potentially secure release with time served. But the April 6th letter, where Ruth confessed to killing her friends and dismembering them without help, could destroy that plan. It is so important to have everything ready if my sanity hearing comes up this month, Ruth wrote in one letter. She insisted that Fern either deliver the documents herself or allow Ruth's brother to pick them up, so Ruth could destroy anything in the file she, quote, might not need. She was adamant that neither her new attorney nor anyone else see the letter. Fern never complied. Ruth's confession and the truth behind it remained out of reach. Here's the letter. It's dated April 6, 1933, the one she wrote in prison and never sent. I am writing the absolute truth of this case in full confidence that you will use it as you see fit in your best judgment, Mr. Richardson. I have full confidence in you and trust you. This is my first and only confession of the case of the homicide of Anne and Hedvig. Anne was used to the world. I truly was not. Jack was the only man I had gone with since my marriage. I was ashamed of things I had done. I could not openly compete with her. I was married and ashamed today, and day she lorded over it. Always smiling and fresh and sweet, well knowing she was hurting me with her taunts. Many evenings Anne would kiss Jack and caress him in our presence, and then after he was gone gloat over not caring a thing for him, but merely working him for money. It was not what Jack did, but the continual taunts made by Anne which drove me beside myself. I could not stand taunts. I just went crazy. Those taunts kept me awake. I could not sleep. I cried. I even prayed. I wrote my parents to please come to me. I was losing my mind. Wild ideas kept me awake. I took sleeping sedatives, luminol. I wrote, "Doctor, my nerves were breaking. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I loved Anne still. But those taunts, I would take more medicine to quiet my nerves, cried to please get things off my mind to sleep." In the space of a few paragraphs, Ruth used the word taunts 11 times. And what about those taunts? Maybe Anne was reminding Ruth that she was a procurer, a hooker, and a pimp, and a bad one at that, since one of the girls she brought to Jack had syphilis. The pills were the lit fuse. Her husband was a morphine addict, a man drifting from one failed job to the next, leaving her alone to pick up the pieces. Her boyfriend, the smooth-talking Jack Holleran, was sleeping with half of Phoenix, including her 2 best friends, and her so-called girlfriend, Anne, was taunting her, whispering barbs about how Ruth could not hold on to a man. Ruth was unraveling. She reached for relief in the form of a little white pill, a barbiturate called phenobarbital, marketed in 1931 under the name luminol. It was sold as a cure-all for everything from vomiting of pregnancy to insanity, and Ruth took it like candy. Luminol was a downer, the pharmacist explained, not a stimulant. It could make you feel calm, detached, but it could also lead to the same kind of bad decisions you'd make during a drinking binge. A fog settled over Ruth's mind. Her thinking dulled. The walls closed in, but the pressure outside kept building. Jack's infidelity, Anne's smirking cruelty, and the lingering echo of her husband's failure. It was a powder keg. Her husband was a drug addict, her boyfriend was a player, her girlfriend was humiliating her, and she was coping by self-medicating with a drug designed to calm epileptic seizures. Something was about to blow. And it did. But can luminol lead really kill you? If you have a psychotic disorder and you're using it to numb the pain of daily life or because the voices in your head are getting too loud, a pharmacist mused, phenobarbital might also cloud your thinking and block your higher emotions. She continued in the letter. Friday night I expected Jack. He did not come. I went to bed. Again, I could not sleep. I got up, went over to Anne's house, my brain whirling. I was so excited. I was panting for breath. Never did I have the slightest dream of hurting Sammy. She simply never entered my mind, except to get Anne, stop those taunts so I could sleep. Nothing more did I think of. I took the gun and a knife. How I would do it, I wasn't sure, but I had no intention of harming Sammy. Jack was as intimate with Sammy as Anne, but it was Anne's cruel taunts that haunted me. I hid in the house next door. Anne and Sammy returned to the bedroom. After they retired, I went to the back door, laid the knife and my shoes outside the door, then crept in the unlocked front door. I sat down on the couch in the same dark room and soon fell to sleep, clutching the gun. I awakened. Sammy had gone to the bathroom. That insane desire, that power, led me on. I started for Anne. My stomach was turning inside out, really twitching, jumping out of me. Outside, not a tremor, but my stomach jumping like convulsions. I retreated, curled up, and went to sleep again. I went back to sleep again. Oh, again and again, all night. I don't know how many times. Sammy kept going to the bathroom. I started for that bedroom and retreated, each time so exhausted, I immediately went to sleep. I pulled Sammy into the bathroom. I cleaned up the floor. I pulled in the trunk from the garage. It was now about 6:30 or 7 a.m. I tugged and finally got Anne from the bed into the trunk. Now, it doesn't sound possible, but this all took about 2 hours. I left for the office. I had pulled the trunk with Anne's body into the living room, but the trunk was unlocked. Sammy was on the bathroom floor all day Saturday. This all happened in the morning. I stayed in my office until 4 p.m. I then took the bag home with me with the gun, knife, pajamas, and dress. I fed my cat and went back to the 2929 North 2nd Street house at around 6 p.m. I really had nothing definite in my mind, no plans. In fact, except for an irresistible impulse to get Anne, I had no other plans. I entered the house through the bathroom window, getting a chair from next door to climb in. I pulled the trunk back into the hall, tried to lift Sammy into it, but that was utterly impossible. I couldn't possibly lift her. She was too heavy. Her body was stiff. I then got 2 cheap knives from the kitchen and severed her into portions I could lift. I was hours doing this, and then inch by inch pulling the trunk back into the living room. In the April 6th letter, Ruth described how she accidentally discharged the gun while washing it on Sunday, just before leaving town. This is what she wrote. Then I washed the gun in the lavatory, and while it was underwater, a bullet remaining in the gun went off. The lead mashed in a sheet. Part of it I threw in the toilet, the other went down the basin. Now this may be when Ruth injured her left hand, not during the struggle with Sammy. A spent shell from the gun was recovered from Ruth's Brill Street apartment. The other half may have been the bullet removed from her hand a week later in Los Angeles. If her left hand wasn't injured until Sunday, that means Ruth was physically capable of packing both bodies into the steamer trunk on Saturday and dismembering Sammy before the accidental self-inflicted wound. The baggage men, after taking the trunk to the truck, informed me it was too heavy to ship as baggage, she wrote. I told them to take the trunk to the 1130 Brill Street, then, which they did. I also left the mattress from Anne's bed rolled up right there in front of those baggage men at 2nd Street, blood-soaked in the living room. Sunday noon, I started getting ready to go to Los Angeles. I transferred portions of Sammy's body to the smaller trunk and suitcase. Then I washed the gun in the lavatory, and while it was underwater, a bullet remaining in the gun went off, and the lead mashed in a sheet, which part of it I threw in the toilet. The other went down the basin. From here on, I think most everything has already been known. Jack Holleran, Happy Jack, was the real ghost of the Winnie Ruth Judd case. A wealthy lumberman and co-owner of the Holleran Bennett Lumber Company, Jack was one of a dozen country club playboys circulating through Phoenix's party girl scene, a scene Ruth, Anne, and Sammy knew too well. But it was Jack's name that stuck to the case, partly because Ruth repeated it for the next 60 years. They met while Ruth was nannying for the Leaford family. The Hollerans lived next door, and Jack, a shameless womanizer, set his sights on the frail, tubercular Ruth. They sat together on the Ford's porch. Ruth confided that her husband, Dr. Judd, was drying out at a sanitarium. She was lonely. Jack saw an opening. Their affair started on Christmas Eve, 1930, and lasted until the night before Ruth shot her 2 best friends, both of whom Jack was also sleeping with. Ruth mistook Jack's attention for love, even as he blatantly bedded her friends and used Ruth to procure other women for his circle. Her delusion, believing Jack loved her, was the fatal flaw at the heart of this story. A woman scorned, a lover betrayed, and blood followed. Ruth claimed in several versions of her story that Jack Holleran was involved, that it was his idea to dismember the bodies, that he was the one who made the call to a mysterious Dr. Brown, a back-alley abortionist with a reputation for quiet, dirty work. Ruth claimed it was Holleran who arranged for the bodies to be packed into steamer trunks and put on the night train to Los Angeles, where one of his connections would make the problem disappear. But in the newly discovered letter, Ruth contradicts herself. In it, she claims she acted alone, that the dismemberment and the packing of the trunks were her idea. The problem is, it doesn't make sense. How could a small, frail woman with a bullet lodged in her left hand, sickly from tuberculosis, manage to saw through bone, sever a body with surgical precision with a bread knife, and then lift and pack 2 corpses into heavy trunks. But here's the thing. Jack's involvement makes even less sense. Why would a wealthy, well-connected playboy with a wife and children go to such psychotic lengths to cover up a crime he supposedly wasn't even present for? As one judge put it, if you're halfway sane and your mistress kills her 2 roommates, you don't say, let's chop them up and take them on a trip. A sane person would worry about being exposed as a cheating husband, not as a butcher. And yet, the bodies were dismembered. The trunks did make it to Los Angeles, and Jack Halloran walked away from it all untouched. The Dr. Brown theory was always a stretch. Prominent defense attorney Larry Debus put it bluntly. You're a doctor. You get a call in the middle of the night from some guy who says, hey, I've got dirt on you. If you don't come up, cut up a body for me, I'll tell everyone you're performing abortions. Huh? You don't jump in your car and head to a crime scene. You weigh your options and say, I think I'll risk the blackmail, and then you roll over and go back to sleep. Even Ruth's own husband told the Board of Pardons and Paroles in 1933 that he couldn't imagine Halloran being involved the way Ruth described. Ruth issued an affidavit that same year, now on file at the Arizona State Library, clearing Halloran of any involvement. Why? Possibly to encourage Halloran's powerful friends to speak favorably about her to the board. Or maybe it was love. A last-ditch attempt to win Halloran's protection. Holleran was indicted as an accessory to the murders, but when Ruth's self-defense claim downgraded the charge to second-degree murder, Holleran walked. Without a first-degree murder conviction, he couldn't be charged as an accessory. But Ruth's jealousy over Jack was real. That much she admitted. She killed Anne and Sammy because Jack had been sleeping with them, but Ruth suggested something darker, too. Jack had been there. Jack had helped her. Jack had escaped justice. Her brother confirmed it. Ruth had told him to take the trunks and dump them in the ocean and not to ask any questions. Ruth never named Jack in her confession letter, maybe because she was scared, maybe because she was protecting him, or maybe because she still loved him. Most people familiar with the Winnie Ruth Judd case know about the infamous, quote, drain pipe letter, the one Ruth wrote while hiding in the Broadway department store in L.A. She tore it up and tried to flush it down the toilet, but the police recovered it. In it, Ruth spun a bizarre, disjointed tale of killing Sammy in self-defense and then shooting Anne to eliminate a witness. That story quickly fell apart under scrutiny. But the April 6th letter? That was different. It matched Ruth's earliest testimony in 1931. It matched the version she gave her attorneys in private, the version her husband told the pardon board, and the version Ruth forbade her lawyers from mentioning in court. It lined up with the statement prosecuting attorney Arthur LaPrade quoted from Ruth's secret session at the penitentiary. It even matched the account Ruth gave during Jack Halloran's indictment hearing. Ruth's consistency was chilling. When psychiatrist Dr. Joseph Catton pressed her about the story she gave to the LA Examiner, Ruth's response was icy. I don't know whether I'm going to tell that story or not, she said. Catton asked if she'd ever dismembered a human being, and her response, I'm going to say that I did. Attorney Mel McDonald called the confession letter devastating, not because it matched her other statements, but because of how it was made. Mel said this wasn't some coerced confession in a police interrogation room. Ruth wrote this privately to an attorney she trusted, knowing he'd use it to defend her. Ruth had nothing to gain, no pressure, no tricks, just a brutal, honest account of murder. So, was Winnie Ruth Judd a victim of emotional manipulation or a cold-blooded killer? Or both? Perhaps the answers are still hidden, locked inside those trunks. Crime doesn't stand still, and sometimes neither do the ghosts it leaves behind. Thanks for listening. If you found this case intriguing, tune into my limited series, Crime Stands Still, where I tell one story, one season, the whole truth, and not just what the jury heard.